Welcome to Bigfoot
and the Bunny.
This is a couple's journey into the mysterious,
the unknown, and the paranormal.
I'm your host, Chris Carr.
And I'm your host, Kristen Johnson.
Together we are Bigfoot and the Bunny.
And we're live.
Happy Saturday, everyone.
Happy Saturday. Welcome to Bigfoot and the Bunny. Chris Carr.
I am Kristen Johnson, as usual.
And we are happy to be here and happy to be talking to you folks. Hope you're doing well. It's a beautiful New England afternoon.
Thank goodness.
The sun is out. You know, it's summer. Seems like it's ending. It's Labor Day weekend. And
it's my favorite time of year, and it's so short.
Just you blink and it's gone.
Yeah.
You know, we've been so hectic lately. We've got so many things going on. And it's hard to keep up with them all. But we got some pretty exciting things coming up. We did want to mention to you guys, we're going to be at Mass Paracon. The 18th is being put on by Sam Baltrusis. So our guest last week, and we had a wonderful conversation with Sam. That was fun.
Yeah, he's a great guy.
Oh, yeah, it was a blast. And if you haven't seen that interview, whatever platform you're watching us on, do go into the archives and check that out with Sam Baltrusis, who has the Curse of Lizzie Borden series coming out on Discovery this month. So we'll be looking for that. That sounded super interesting. And we'll be at the Mass Paracon as a vendor. We're going to be selling some things. We got some handmade crafts and things like dowsing rods and all kinds of really cool things. So we got some surprises for people, and it'll be fun. And we're going to be promoting our show here, obviously. We're just looking forward to having a good time. And then the week after that, the 24th and 25th, there is a public investigation being put on by Shay Carroll of Paranormal Buzz Radio. And it's at Wilson Castle in Proctor, Vermont. And we're going to be there the second night. Same night, it's being hosted by Duo Demonology. Our friends Carl and James will be there. And we can't wait to go and hang out. It's all for charity.
Everything that goes back into the castle for restoration.
That's right. And the preservation of the castle. So it's all for them. And that's going to be a great time. And I believe another host that's involved there, Spirits of the Realm, don't quote me, but they're doing the world's largest ghost hunt that day, because I believe it's National Paranormal Day this Sunday or something. And we're going to be there overnight, and they have simultaneous investigations going on around the country that they're going to be live streaming. So as we get closer to that date, we'll provide more information.
It's Wilson Castle. So
we'll be at Wilson Castle. That's going to be really fun. So we got a really good show for you this week. And I know I say that every week, and that's because, you know,
we always
got some amazing guests.
Just about.
I also wanted to mention our good friend Gail Heisen came out with her podcast this week.
Yes,
we love Gail.
Yeah, a small, medium at large.
It's called A Small, Medium at Large, and we loved it. We both listened to it, and in fact, we were listening to it again a little while ago, and it's wonderful. Available wherever you get podcasts, so do check that out. She's a friend of ours, friend of the show, and she's terribly interesting and funny. I love Gail. She's great.
I love her, yeah.
Great. So I love the point she was making about culture, and she was talking about psychic abilities, you know, and how our culture here makes us often think that these things you have to learn them, or they're just not part of our culture, you know, or they're not real, where in other cultures in the world, it's just a given, you know, from the time you're
like
born.
Native American
telepathy
cultures and yes,
you know, these sort of things. Yeah, exactly. Native American cultures.
That's what all they do, she said. So
yeah. So that's great. I already see some people out there. Hey, Anne-Marie Young, how you doing?
Hello, my beautiful friend.
Hello, beautiful people. Love it. Hey, man. Hey, Joshua, how you doing?
Hi, Josh.
Bunnyman. Yeah, great. Also, I want to let you guys know, speaking of Paracons, about the Temple Fearfest Paracon going on in Salina, Kansas. Sorry, is also occurring this month, and there's a link there in the chat. You can check that out. And a lot of our good
it's our
friends
Pun family
from Pun TV are hosting that and going to be there, and that's going to be awesome. And if it was a little closer, we would be there too.
I know.
I really want to go. So, hey, Courtney, how you doing?
Hi, Courtney.
And all right. So that's awesome. That's something to look forward to, and we'll give you guys some more details on that too as well. So our guest this week is has a new book out. It's called The Witches and Warlocks of Massachusetts. His name is Peter Muise. He's going to talk to us about a whole bunch of cool things: witches, warlocks, legends, lore, Puckwudgies, and sea serpents by the New England shore. So let's bring him on right away. Here we go. Hey, Peter.
Hi, happy to be here. Thanks for having me today.
How you doing?
Good. I'm excited to talk about a variety of interesting topics with you today.
Well, we're in New England together, and New England is just the weirdest place, right?
Yeah, I mean, right. Some people argue that it is. There's a lot of history here, right? I mean, it's probably one of the oldest settled parts of the United States, and settled by English-speaking people. And so, like, we have the longest written history, I think, in the United States. So I think we have more opportunity for there to be weird stuff here than other parts of the country, right? Just because it's a longer history. And also, I would say, the earliest settlers here, the Puritans, came over like early 1600s. And so really those folks, if you think about it, that's like a late Renaissance period. Like, that is not the modern era at all. Those people could have seen Shakespeare performed live on stage the first time. Mm-hmm. And so they're really coming from like a much more magical, supernatural worldview, I think, than like Thomas Jefferson or something like that in the Revolutionary War. Like, the Puritans were like, the world is full of magic. It's full of supernatural forces for good and evil, and we're living it, right? And so I think we have that holdover here still in our history. So, you do see like the three major horror writers in America all came from New England. Like, Edgar Allan Poe was born in Boston, grew up in Boston until he finally was like, I can't stand these uptight Puritan people, I'm leaving. So you had Edgar Allan Poe, then you had H.P. Lovecraft from Rhode Island, down near where you guys are, and then Stephen King from Maine. And so I think there's something about the history that just makes these people just need to be like, I need to like write this weird stuff down and get it on paper,
Right. It is. It's a strange area, being a little older, and it just seems to have a different feel to it than a lot of other parts of the country. And there is some kind of dark stuff in there, and the way those Puritans, treated some of the other people. They were a little ultra religious in a way, right? And they're, like you said, full of superstition. We're not kind to the Quakers, in reference to like Spider Gates, our friend's cemetery that we were talking about before the show, and one of our favorite places. We were pretty much treated like witches, and we talked a little bit about that last week.
You know she is a witch. She looks like one.
It's the Monty Python reference.
Yeah.
There were a lot of witches going around, between Salem and the hangings and the crushing of
I mean, even before Salem, there were something like 85 trials involving witches in New England before the Salem witch trials even happened. And out of those 85 trials, 11 people were executed. So 5 of them were in Massachusetts and 6 of them were in Connecticut. And I believe they were all women. Certainly all the ones in Massachusetts were women. And, there might have been a few other people executed. It's not entirely clear. Sometimes the trial records are a little mysterious, like someone is in jail awaiting her execution, but then there's no record of her execution. So maybe she just died of natural causes while awaiting execution. So there are a couple cases like that, but it was around like 11 people executed before Salem. So definitely, I mean, the Puritans, let's say, like the Pilgrims landed in 1620, Salem's founded in 1626, Boston 1630. The first person executed for a witch, I think, was 1648 in Boston, right? Margaret Jones. So that's not too soon after they settled the city. Like they settled Boston. It's like, okay, 18 years later, it's time to execute a witch, And even in 1644, Governor John Winthrop wrote in his diary that a small ship had exploded in Boston Harbor, and someone on the ship had accidentally shot their pistol into the gunpowder store, and the whole ship exploded. And they found the bodies of most of the crew members, except one person they could not find, this one man they could not find. And John Winthrop, the governor, wrote that man was suspected of being a necromancer. So they believed that he had been dealing with the devil and practicing sort of dark magic, and they couldn't find his corpse in the water. And shortly afterwards, people around Boston Harbor reported seeing strange lights emerging from the water and forming the shape of a large man. And this shape sort of floated around above the harbor for several nights in a row. And people across Boston heard this ominous voice saying, "Boy, boy, come away, boy, come away, boy." And John Winthrop is pretty much saying, like, oh, this is the devil. The devil has come back to find that necromancer and drag him down to hell. And so people saw this for like a week, and then it ended. So I think John Winthrop sort of assumed that the necromancer was dragged back to hell, whether you believe that or not. But that is what John Winthrop sort of wrote in his book. So that was 1644. So that's one of the earliest records I found of like a necromancer or a witch.
They believed.
They did believe. I don't know if I believe, but they believed that.
It's interesting because it sounds almost a little bit like a UFO or UAP sighting as well. We've got things in the sky, and there were reports of those sort of things. And I've talked about one on the show before. It was like the earliest UFO report in the United States.
16.
And it was, I forget the year, but it was just outside of Boston in a river.
It's on the Muddy River.
And they saw the lights in the sky, and they thought it looked like a pig.
Right.
The thing they knew, it looked like a flying pig. And it was pretty much like a UFO, almost abduction. They had lost time. There was a time-lapse phenomena that happened. They wound up way down the river, further than they were.
Yeah, it's true. That's that was the Muddy River, which borders Boston and Brookline. So that's like half a mile from Fenway Park or so. And so like now the area is very built up, but it's interesting to think that back then, 1636, whenever it was much more swampy and kind of wildernessy. But it is fascinating. Like they were transported against the current, right? Like somehow they were transported against the current and had no clue how they got there, which is really freaky. It's really freaky.
It's freaky.
Very similar to
I can't imagine what they thought either at the time. What their thinking was. It's
like, why did this flaming, glowing pig in the sky transport us back up a river? Like they don't say. A couple years ago, an artist made a giant pig sculpture and put it near the Muddy River for like a summer. It was part of this summer art project. So to memorialize that, there was this giant pig sculpture hanging from a tree.
Wow, that's really cool, though.
That's interesting. I didn't know that. That's so cool. I always think of it like that's what they knew. Like, it looked like some kind of animal, so they attributed it to a pig. And, people are still kind of like that, with the UFO phenomena where whatever they're familiar with, there'll be a time period where people see saucers and then they're triangles or they're tic tacs or whatever it is, whatever's in the consciousness of the people.
Yeah, it's true. I feel like people always see or experience strange phenomena. They always have. They probably always will, right? In the far future, like thousands of years from now, people still experience strange things. But it's kind of how we interpret it and how we understand it that will change, right? Like maybe in the past, if you saw little creatures with pointed ears and you had missing time, you're like, oh, I was abducted by fairies. But now if that happened, you're like, oh, I was abducted by a UFO. Or maybe if you're very religious, like, oh, I was abducted by demons, right? There are lots of options of what you think is abducting you. But people still think they're being abducted, whatever the cause is,
Right. If it's not like a discarnate spirit, it falls into this kind of wider realm of like, is it an alien? Is it a fairy? And there's a lot of fairy folklore that relates right to New England, right?
There is. Yeah. It's not as prevalent as like the witch folklore or modern ghost folklore. And it's interesting because, again, we'll go back to the Puritans. When the Puritans came over here, they came from a part of England called East Anglia. And that was part of England where there were the most witch trials, right? The biggest witch trials in England happened in East Anglia. So when they came over to basically Massachusetts and Connecticut, they kind of brought those witchcraft beliefs with them. So then we had like the biggest witch trials in North America because they came from that part of England, came from East Anglia. East Anglia didn't have a ton of fairy folklore. They weren't big on the fairies there. So the Puritans came here, they're like, oh, there are no fairies in New England. There's none. Like, this is fairy-free zone. It's full of witches. It's full of demons. The devil's here, but there aren't any fairies. And, of course, the Native Americans here had, like, this rich lore of, like, lots of beings that lived in the woods, right? Lots of small creatures that lived in the woods, like the
elementals.
Like Mackay, they would call them, like, Makayawa Sugs and Granny Squant and all these creatures who live in the woods. But the Puritans, like, had their blinders on. They were not really interested in what the Native Americans thought about these things, right? They just thought that was all like devilry or black magic, so they didn't want to pay attention to it. And really, it's only recently, I think, kind of the two streams, like the mainstream English speaking culture has started to realize that there are probably little people in the woods, right? And so now people talk about Pukwudgies or things like that sort of lurking in the woods. And that's, it's interesting because the term Pukwudgie is not a local term. Like that doesn't come from any Native American group in New England. It actually comes from the Ojibwa who are out in the Midwest. And
like Indiana, or no, what was it?
Yeah, it's out there. And it was sort of popularized by Longfellow, the poet Longfellow. He wrote this long poem like the Song of Hiawatha, right? About Ojibwa mythology. And there are Pukwudgies in that. And that was a super popular poem. And he was from Cambridge. And somehow like people sort of adopted that term, Pukwudgie, from the Midwest. So now it's used here as well. And like, a rose by any other name smells as sweet, right? So what does it matter what people are calling them, I guess, in some sense, right? And people certainly are experiencing things, whatever. Again, we go back to that, like people are having experiences, who knows what they are, So
Exactly.
But they document it, they talk about it, and I just love that word, Pukwudgie.
I do too.
I think that's one of the reasons it stuck around. Like the original native terms for the little folk here are just harder for English speakers to say. They're like Makayawaksaga, Namawakayamasaga. These words are harder for us to say, versus Pukwudgie is easier for English speakers to say. So I think that's why it caught on. And it was sort of introduced by a couple of Wampanoag men on Cape Cod. They talked to a folklorist named Elizabeth Renard. And when they told her the stories, they used the word Pukwudgie, right? And this was probably in the 1930s. Wow. And so she sort of picked it up from them, and that's how it spread. It was from these two Wampanoag men on Cape Cod. Yeah. And their stories are about, like the Pukwudgies sort of are pretty malevolent in the stories they tell. They're like hunting down sort of this giant Moshop who's like he's like a culture hero, right? He sort of is a protector of mankind. He sort of establishes the landscape. And then the Pukwudgies kind of, slaughter his family and chase him off sort of at the end of the story. So, yeah.
Well, that is a little horrifying.
I was just going to
use
it. Is.
Word is like trickster type things.
Like
that are kind of like a little nefarious, but not necessarily, totally evil and will kill you.
Right. Yeah. I think if, you look at any sort of fairy folklore, it tends to be like they are neutral, maybe like morally neutral beings. Like they're not your best friend. They're not necessarily your enemy, but you just want to proceed with caution, right? And they're not like, if you're out in the woods, maybe you shouldn't be talking about them loudly because they might overhear you and become insulted by the things you say. Or proceed with caution at certain seasons when they're active out in the woods and things like that. So it's it's interesting. It's I know like the Freetown State Forest, people have often talked about Pukwudgies in the Freetown State Forest.
Absolutely. They actually have a sign that says Pukwudgie Crossing.
Oh, do they really? I haven't seen it.
They just put it out a couple of years ago.
The last time I went, I didn't see it. I guess I went, maybe it was probably like 3 or 4 years ago. And I will say it was a little spooky there. Like, I don't know if I believe that there are Pukwudgies in the Freetown State Forest. I'm knocking on wood as I say this to not offend any entities.
Thank you.
But I will say that the Freetown State Forest was a little spooky. Like where we parked, we were near a gun range. So immediately I get out of the car, you can hear people shooting guns, which never puts me at ease.
No,
I'm like, who's shooting guns? A lot of the trees have been killed by probably like pine, borer beetles, right? So we were walking down this road with all these dead pine trees. It was like early March, so the trees were still bare. And as they would blow around the wind, they would like squeak together, right? Like rattling and squeaking. I'm like, this is just like unsettling.
I've seen this horror movie. We walked for like maybe 45 minutes. We didn't see any other people until we met this group of teens who were clearly like high out of their minds. And again, which does not put me in a good state. I'm like, oh God, like this is not good. And we're going to the Sonnet Ledge is where we're going, which is this ledge where there's supposed to be like Pukwudgies and ghosts. So we're just like, a little freaked out by this point, like gunfire, dead trees, weird noises, teens who are all drugged out. Like this is not like a peaceful walk in the park.
No.
And finally we get to the Sonnet Lech, and there's like this group of school kids there having a picnic. You know what I mean? And like laughing and playing around. I'm like, oh, okay. Like it's all fine now. It's all fine. But getting there was not the most relaxing experience I've had, you know?
Yeah. And there's all kinds of phenomena attributed to Freetown State Forest.
Yeah, it's true.
Bigfoot.
Yeah.
It was President Bush Sr. that was actually flying over the Freetown Forest, and he literally said, and he told everybody he saw a UFO.
He did.
Wow.
Yes.
I didn't know that.
Yeah.
And now you guys probably read Christopher Bolzano's book, right?
We had him on like 3 times. We love Chris.
He is great. He is great. And
we do have his books. Yes, we've read them.
He's great. And the story I love from his book, because I like witches and warlocks, is about the Freetown Forest witch, which is super creepy. It feels like a story you would tell in the late summer, right, as the sun is setting, around a campfire, or just on your back porch with friends. It just like these kids, they're all boys, you know, are playing in the woods, and they hear like this disembodied laughter, and they don't know where it's coming from. And it sounds like an older woman is laughing at them, and they're just freaked out. And one of them thinks they can even almost see like an invisible outline of a person, as if like the light is being refracted off of somebody. And they're like, oh, this is creepy. We're 8 years old. This creeped us out, right? And so they all run home. And for like years afterwards, they have this set of experiences in the woods, often associated with this older woman who appears in their dreams and things. Like many of the boys had dreams about an older woman trying to get into their bedrooms at night.
Oh my God.
Like, you know, knocking on their window, just like in the old Salem's Lot movie. And one boy did let her in his dream, and, you know, she attacks him. He's screaming. The parents come in. They just see the boy thrashing around his bed, but they can't see anybody attacking him. And eventually they move away from Freetown, that family. That's the only way that they get this kind of supernatural assault to end. But there are lots of other things associated kind of with this Freetown witch. Like one of the boys sees a cat, like a large black cat, but it walks on 2 legs out in the woods. Just like creepy stuff. And this is in Christopher Bolzano's book.
Yeah.
But the Freetown Historical Society, Christopher Bolzano notes this. They say that no one was ever executed as being a witch in Freetown. There's no evidence of witchcraft trials in Freetown. They don't have any record of anyone living in the woods. So they're not sure like what this was, right? Again, it comes down to like people having these freaky experience, and it seems like it's a witch, but is it a witch? Like, and there were no real witches even, right? There were no real witches. So it kind of comes down to this, I don't know, is it a ghost?
Like role type things, you know, where the person is an outsider, or it seems to be. This is like the stereotype, right? Maybe this older woman, she's doing things differently. She must be a witch. It's kind of like the Monty Python, right? She's a witch.
Yeah.
No, she looks like one.
Right, exactly. It's you look at the people who were executed as witches, like before Salem, let's say there were 5 in Massachusetts, and a lot of them had somehow transgressed like the societal norms. Even if they hadn't necessarily broken the law, they kind of were like outside the societal norms. Like in Dorchester, a woman named Alice Lake was executed as a witch because the trial records are very scanty. They don't say like what sort of magic she was accused of, but their trial records are more about like, oh, well, you know, she had premarital sex, right? And then she got pregnant from premarital sex, and she tried to abort her baby, right? Terrible. So therefore, it's pretty clear if she did those 2 things, obviously she must be a witch too, right? If she did those horrible things. And it's funny how like times don't change that much in a lot of ways, you know?
That's right.
That's very true.
Some of the women who were executed were just argumentative. There was a woman named Ann Hibbins who lived in Boston. She and her husband came over. They were very wealthy. They had like a big house down in Boston. They had like 300 acres of land in Brookline. So they were very wealthy. But she was very argumentative. She was very frugal. So like she would argue with craftsmen who are building their house, like, no, you're charging me too much money for those cabinets. I'm not going to pay it, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And this went against the norms of the time. Like women were not supposed to be argumentative. And she was actually excommunicated from the church because she was so argumentative. And then when her husband died, they accused her of witchcraft and executed her, which is terrible. And she's actually in the Scarlet Letter. That Nathaniel Hawthorne took that character and put her in the Scarlet Letter, where she is a witch trying to tempt Hester Prynne out into the forest to meet Satan, basically. But she was an actual person. So it is true. Like, it was often these people who were slightly outside the norm. And in the Salem witch trials, it was 19 people are executed. One is crushed to death during interrogation, right? It wasn't technically an execution, but it was death by torture. But a lot of those people, again, were just on the wrong side of political arguments in Salem, right? They were like the enemies of the Putnam family, who was the ruling kind of power in Salem. Or a lot of the women, again, it was they had somehow transgressed sexual rules. Like one of the women, I'll get her name wrong. It's either Sarah Goode or Sarah Osborne. She had been married to a farmer. The farmer died. She was alone, and she hired this handsome young manservant to come work on the farm. And all her neighbors were like, ooh, we know what's going on here, right? She's getting some action outside of marriage. It's a sin. And even though she later married the handsome manservant, people remember that when it was the witch trials, like, oh, well, she had premarital sex with this manservant. She clearly must be a witch. Martha Corey, whose husband was the man pressed to death. Martha Corey was also executed as being a witch. And she had an illegitimate child before she was married with a black man, which was like super scandalous at the time. Oh
boy, yeah.
And all that, although her son was adopted by her subsequent husbands and just accepted into the family, people in Salem were like, ooh, like if she did that, think of the other thing she must do. She must be a witch. Right. And so what didn't take much, I think, to kind of, they were pretty strict, had pretty strict moral rules, so.
Interesting. Yeah. And Joshua Dixon in our audience there says, but they didn't crucify the man that impregnated her.
Yeah.
Right. Right. Exactly right. I mean, it was different rules for men and women, I think. And you see that in there were some men in Massachusetts and Connecticut, certainly before the Salem witch trials, though, who would kind of boast that they were witches, right? It was like, ooh, I'm a tough guy. I'm a witch. Like, don't mess with me. I will cause trouble in your house. In particular, there was a guy named John Godfrey who lived up in Essex County, and he never settled down. He was kind of an unusual person. Like, he never married, never settled down, which is very rare in Puritan New England because it was very based on family. But he never married, never settled down. He was tried for being a witch 4 times, and he was never found guilty. But he would often boast that he was a witch. He's like, oh yeah, he would say things like, I've signed up for service with a certain master who can do certain things for me, if you know what I mean. So don't mess with me or something bad's going to happen to your livestock, right? Everyone's like, oh, do you mean you're a witch? He's like, well, I can't say, but maybe.
Wink, wink, nudge, nudge.
So you better give me the job I'm asking for. You better loan me that money I need because, bad things will happen to you. And so there are 4 trials where he is accused of witchcraft. And it is like classic witch trial stuff where supposedly he had a large black crow that was his familiar spirit. And he supposedly also had what they called the witch's teat, which is how the witch's familiar would suck blood out of a witch's body. So it was like a small protuberance. And in John Godfrey's case, that witch's teat was under his tongue. So imagine this giant black crow, sucking the blood out of this guy's mouth under his tongue, right? So this is what people are testifying, that he had this familiar spirit that would suck blood out of his tongue, basically. And then it would fly out and attack people at his command. And there's one case where John Godfrey argued with this family called the Remingtons who lived in Haverhill. And John Godfrey was like, oh, I want to take care of your cattle. I want to be your herdsman, so you better hire me. And they're like, no, we have a teenage son. He can take care of it himself. We don't need you. And John Godfrey's like, you'll be sorry that you did this. And so several months later, the teenage son is out riding a horse, herding the cattle, and this large black crow appears in the sky and kind of swoops down and scares the horse. And the boy falls off the horse. And I think the horse lands on him even.
Oh, geez.
And so the teenage boy is just like a mess. And he's lying at home recuperating from all his injuries. And John Godfrey shows up at the house. He's like, oh, I guess your father should have hired me for that job. Were you spooked by a big black bird? And the kid's like, oh, you know, stupid bitch. And so, but he was never found guilty of witchcraft.
Tells you something right there, like you said.
Right. If that had been a woman, the woman would have been executed.
Long gone.
Long gone. But since he was a man, he could get away with kind of this.
Especially with the threat, like he'll lose the day.
Yeah. Right. He also was involved with like 30 other, what was it? It might be like 60 other court cases. He was just a troublemaker. And I think people also knew he was a troublemaker. So they probably put that witchcraft stuff in context of like, oh, he's always fighting with people, suing people, petty theft, like whatever is going on. But it was all part of the thing. But again, like if he had been a woman, he would have been executed after just one witch trial, not after not walking scot-free after 4, so.
And some people would have called him a warlock, right? And then that's an interesting term. My first thought is immediately Charlie Sheen, the Vatican assassin warlock.
Tiger's blood.
What was in that bottle? Apparently, it was a lot of cocaine.
Involved with that.
It's like if you look at the witch trial accounts from that time, witch is used for men and women. Like anybody can be a witch. A man or a woman can be a witch, even a child. Like a baby. Like they were like 3-year-old witches, 5-year-old witches, whatever in the Salem witch trials, right? Anybody could be a witch, but they also had additional terms they would use for men. So, like George Burroughs, who was a former minister in Salem, who had argued with the Putnam family, and then left Salem because they wouldn't pay his salary. It was like this big political argument. He left Salem and moved to Maine. But during the Salem witch trials, people in Salem said, oh, the leader of the Salem witches is George Burroughs. George Burroughs is a conjurer, right? He was like not just a witch, he was a conjurer. So it was like here's witches here, conjurers up here. You know what I mean? So you hear witch, conjurer, wizard, warlock, necromancer, as I mentioned earlier, shows up. So they had a variety of terms for men, but usually for women, it was pretty straightforward. It was just like witch.
Yeah, that's interesting. And it's not that those things didn't exist either. There was certainly magic and sorcery date back till pre-biblical days.
Yeah, it's
further than that, really.
The
Marians we've talked about with the spells and clay statues that they would bring the god into the clay statues,
or the demon, as we'll call it. The entity.
Yeah, there was like I always am clear. Like no one who was executed as a witch was a witch, right? Those are just people who were executed for political reasons or because they were unpopular or whatever. But people in New England did use magic, right? Magic was very common. And often they use the magic to actually defend against witches. So you see things like horseshoes. People still will put up horseshoes, right? You nail the horseshoe up and it should keep a witch, they would say, from entering your house. And there's an interesting story from Newbury where a woman named Elizabeth Morse was suspected of being a witch. And this was, I want to say the 1660s. So Elizabeth Morse was suspected of being a witch. It's hard for me to say. And one of her neighbors was like, oh, I'm afraid of Elizabeth Morse. I don't want her to come in my house. So I'm going to put up this horseshoe. So she nails a horseshoe up over the door. And one of this women's neighbors was a really devout Puritan. And he was like, no, do not put up that horseshoe. Any magic is bad. That is the devil's magic, putting up that horseshoe. I'm going to take that horseshoe down. So he took the horseshoe down. Then Elizabeth Morse came to visit her neighbor who was sick. The neighbor dies, probably from natural causes, but everyone's like, oh, if only we'd have left up that horseshoe, she wouldn't have come in the house. You know what I mean? But, but so like
horseshoe, that's common. Is that a New England thing, the horseshoe?
It's a European thing. It comes from Europe, and the Puritans brought it over. And it was sort of a general belief that like metal objects had power over witches.
Probably iron.
Probably iron, right? Like, and you also see silver too. But it's like the Puritans didn't have a lot of silver, so it was more iron. So it was like horseshoes. But you read about a house in Danvers who belonged to a guy named, what was it? Zerubbabel Endicott, I think was his name, was like a very good first name. But the first name was definitely Zerubbabel, which is a great name. But archaeologists were looking through his house, and he had buried a metal harpoon in the chimney, right? So there's a piece of metal to keep someone from coming down. And you also see stories about doing things with nails, right? Like if a witch walks by your house and leaves a footprint in front of your house, you drive the nail into her footprint, his or her footprint, and then they can't move, even though they're like a mile down the road. But somehow, like if you put it in their footprint, they're stuck. You know what I mean? They're powerless against the metal.
And like hoodoo folk, which is African American folk magic, hoodoo will use the footprints in some of their rituals. Mind your own footprints and be careful of that. The chimney's very interesting. It's like, well, but that's not Santa.
No. But and you do see, like people would also put shoes in chimneys with the idea to catch sort of the spirits that may come down your chimney. And in a lot of the witch trial accounts, or even witch legends that come later, like entities enter your house through the chimney because it's an opening, right? It's an unprotected opening. And so you do see people like putting shoes in the chimney with the idea that the spirit's going to get stuck in that shoe somehow. And it's very similar to putting the stockings by the chimney for Santa, right? It's like,
I was just thinking that the correlation to that. Yeah.
Yeah. The folklore survives in strange ways in modern times. Like Santa's coming down your chimney and it's good versus, a witch or a demonic spirit's coming down your chimney. You want to prevent it by putting something to trap it, So sort of the grossest, one of the grossest forms of defensive magic you would read about is a witch bottle. I don't know if you know what a witch bottle is.
Well, I've heard the term.
But it was basically if let's say people thought I was bewitched, right? I'm like thrashing around, I'm sick. Peter's been bewitched. They would take some of my urine and put it in a bottle or maybe a jar, whatever they had. And then you would add like nails and broken glass and whatever you had that was sharp, with the idea that when the witch has bewitched me, they've made this connection between me and them, right? There's this connection between us. And that's how the evil magic is flowing into me, through this connection. But that connection goes to all parts of my body and all products of my body, even my urine. And so you couldn't stick nails in me to hurt the witch, but you can stick nails in my urine to hurt the witch. And so by putting like my urine in a bottle with these nails, that would hurt the witch who was bewitching me. So you see a lot of that in folk accounts and trials. And sometimes if you wanted to be extra powerful, you would like take that bottle full of urine and nails and broken glass and you put it in the fire so it would explode, right? So you have these bottles of exploding urine full of like nails to try to get the witch out, which is just insane to me. That's actually insane to me.
That's sympathetic magic though. That's like a bit of a person's hair, urine.
Right.
Their blood, even, blood sorcery.
Yeah, there was an account from New Hampshire, and I may get this guy's name wrong. I think his name was Simeon Smith, who was living in this town in New Hampshire. I want to say it's Wentworth, New Hampshire. And people thought he was a sorcerer or a wizard or whatever. And he was on the side of the revolution during the Revolutionary War. So he wanted to break away from England, basically. And he was a wizard. There was a family in town who were Tories. Therefore, they were sympathetic to England and wanted the colonies to stay with England. And supposedly Simeon Smith bewitched their son. That Simeon Smith blinded their son and made him sick. And so these British sympathizers, these Tories were like, we have to do something. Simeon Smith has bewitched our son. And so they took some of their son's blood and put it in a bottle. And they thought, okay, this will do it. Like, this is going to take care of Simeon Smith. But then the cork fell out of the bottle. They're like, okay, this is not working. Then they put the cork back in. They stuck a knife through the cork so the knife blade hit the blood. Like, okay, this is going to do it. But again, the cork fell out of the bottle. And so the third time they took the blood, took the cork, took the knife, put it in the fire. The blood boiled, hit the blade, exploded out the top, whatever. And then Simeon Smith died. And like, whew, all right, finally it worked. And
Wow.
That story's interesting because it is from the 1700s, right? This is from the Revolution, so like 1770s. It's not from the 1600s. It's interesting because it involves the Revolutionary War, which is kind of unusual to me. And it's also interesting that, like, you know, you feel pretty sympathetic for the Tories here. Like, oh, their poor son is being blinded by a wizard. The kid has nothing to do with politics, right? Just leave him alone.
Right.
So, and you hear these stories and they often end, well, oh, and then the witch died, right? So that's how we knew that Simeon Smith was the witch. Or like, let's say your butter isn't churning, right? A common problem in Puritan era or early New England, like my butter isn't churning, it's not coming together. So we think a witch has bewitched our butter churn. So you would take some of the cream out of the butter churn, you'd throw it on the fire. And supposedly that would burn the witch who was bewitching your butter churn. And so what would happen is, like, you throw the cream on the fire, then the butter churns, great. And then the next day you see, like, oh, that cranky old lady down the street, she's got a burn on her face. And that's how we know that she was the witch, right? Like we threw the cream in the fire and then she got burned even though she lives like a mile away. So therefore she's the witch. Of course, like, cooking back then was super dangerous. Like, huge percentages of women died from cooking accidents because they had like these kettles that weighed like 35 pounds in a giant fireplace and all this stuff. So everybody was getting burned. But when that one got burned, that's how you knew she was a witch. So there's always this, like, you're looking for connections to see, like, to prove your belief that your neighbor was a witch, which I don't believe. But so.
No.
Yeah, and I'm sure in most of those cases it was purely just part of their their perceptions and what they put together, and they wanted it to be true. You know, people want things to be true, and in the paranormal world we have to talk about like pareidolia and your mind makes these connections.
You see those patterns even if the patterns aren't quite there, right?
That's right. You could be looking at the clouds, as a good example, and you see an antelope or something, or tiger, whatever it is, and another person looks and goes, "No, it's just clouds."
What does that antelope mean, right? That's the
You're right. I mean, what's the deep meaning of the antelope?
Right.
Don't get him started on the antelope. He has a thing about this, and it's good, but
it's not relevant to what we're talking
about
right now.
Yeah.
But it's very strange, and there's more modern legends of witches than that. And then you're talking about the 1700s, and that's a time frame that people don't often associate with New England witchery.
Right, it's true. I think like when I was writing the book, Witches and Warlocks in Massachusetts, I sort of looked at the stories in that book in three different ways, three different eras. There's like the Puritan era, and that is like witch trials, right? People took witchcraft very seriously. There were trials, there were executions. It was a very serious matter to people. And after the Salem witch trials were over, people in New England realized that you could not prove witchcraft in court, right? At first, I think the trials had a lot of support, but as it went on and more people were accused, and like all these people were like good neighbors, how can there be 150 witches in Massachusetts? And then the governor's wife is accused, just like exploded. And I think when that ended, people were like, oh, you know what? You can't prove someone is a witch in court. But they didn't necessarily stop believing in witches. And I think from like in the 1700s and the 1800s, you will find a lot of legends from various towns in the area about witches, but there's no trial involved. But those stories are generally about people who really lived. And they are similar in some ways to the Puritan stories, but not identical. And often the stories are about, this is how you would defeat a witch. So it is like, then you put your urine in a bottle and that took care of the witch, right? Or my pig was bewitched. It was acting strange, just like walking on its hind legs and grunting in strange grunts. I've never seen a pig do that. It's been bewitched. And you like would cut the pig's ear off or something like that. And then the next day you see that neighbor you had the fight with, and they're like have a bandage over their ear, like, oh, that's how we know that she is a witch. So the same thing went on in the 18th and 19th century. But I also think, when you get into the 19th century, people were much more educated in the scientific method. The whole area had become much more industrialized, like the big mill towns were here. trains had come in, right? Boston was like a center of culture and learning at the time, and it was a big port city. And so people were more skeptical also. So people would tell these stories, but I think they also told them a little more to entertain each other and less to be like super serious about it. Although you do find like some accounts from even the 19th century of people who thought they were bewitched. There's an interesting one from Pepperell, Massachusetts. It was a family, the Lawrence family, lived in Pepperell, Massachusetts. I think it was 1843 or so. And the father's name was Absalom Lawrence. And they lived in a farmhouse. They had like several children. And they noticed one day that they were hearing these odd noises in the house, like a groaning noise, like a type of noise. Imagine that type of noise coming from your house. So you would be a little spooked, right? Doors opening and closing on their own, pots and pans moving around in the kitchen. And like, to me, this sounds like what we would call poltergeist activity now, right? Mm-hmm. And at first, Absalom Lawrence was like, oh, I think my house has a ghost in it. I definitely think my house has a ghost in it. And it sounds like a ghost to me too. But then his oldest daughter, who was like 13 or 14, started to have show strange behavior. It's like her jaw locked. She couldn't open her jaw. Then when she would open her jaw, like her tongue would stick out to the bottom of her chin, like, right? This type of thing. She's writhing around in pain. She's making strange noises. And he's like, you know what? This isn't a ghost. This is a witch. Someone is bewitching my family. And so this is 1843, right? So the area is industrialized. It's only a few years before the Civil War. Like, America has moved on from the Salem witch trials in a big way. But Absalom Lawrence is like, no, someone has bewitched my family. There's a witch here. You know, if this had been the Puritan era, there would have been a trial and they would have, brought a neighbor in for questioning, but that's not going to happen in 1843. And so he looks in the newspaper to find somebody to help him. And he finds this guy who is an animal magnetizer. And animal magnetism was like an early version of hypnotism. And so basically, Absalom Lawrence hires this hypnotist who comes to his house. And the hypnotist has an attractive young assistant with him, as hypnotists often do, right? And he puts his attractive... What?
Because they're hypnotists.
Because they're hypnotists, right? So he puts the attractive young assistant into a trance. And while she is in a trance, she says, there is definitely a witch, like, affecting this household. There was a witch who was tormenting your family. And the assistant says, I can see her. She's a gray-haired woman. She is riding a horse with no horseshoes on its feet, which is significant. And when she comes off the horse, she creeps under the crack in the door. She creeps through the keyhole, and she is bewitching your family, which is creepy, right? It's like a Conjuring movie or something.
Extremely creepy.
Extremely creepy.
Yes.
And so they think, oh, maybe this is a neighbor or something like that. And the animal magnetist, this hypnotist, uses his like hypnotic powers, his hypnotic magnetism force to force the witch away out of the house. And as she supposedly exits the house, they hear the groaning like, and they hear all the noises at once, then they're gone. And like, whew, we thank you, animal magnetizer person, you have saved our family. And of course, they have to pay him for this. But it doesn't work. It starts up again like a few weeks later. And eventually, Absalom Lawrence and his family just moved. They moved to Hollis, New Hampshire. And that was the end of the phenomena for them. But that's 1843, which is, it's very similar to things you would have seen in the 1600s, but, 200 years later, with a hypnotist added in.
Right.
Yeah.
Throw in the hypnotism, and we've come along with some scientific progress. We're moving to the spiritualist movement and all of that, right? So it adds another element, but it's still kind of the repression of women threaded through there as well. And one of our listeners here, Irene Takura from Japan, she noted here in Japan, a man was able to call them a doctor and prescribe herbs to a patient, but if you were a woman, you would be called a witch and killed.
Yes.
And she goes on to say, but there are more women who are doctors than men now.
Yes.
So
and that's interesting because you look at some of the witch trial accounts from the 1600s, like the Puritan era, and some of the women, not all, but some of the women who were accused were herbal healers, right? Like Margaret Jones, who was the first person executed in 1648, the first woman hanged as a witch in Massachusetts, was an herbal healer. And she lived in Charlestown with her husband. She was supposedly very successful at what she did. And her cures were really basic things. It was like anise seed soaked in brandy. And she would give you this anise seed soaked in brandy stuff you could just buy today at the supermarket. Yeah. And it was like, heal your heart problems or whatever. And everyone's like, wow, Margaret Jones is super skilled at healing. And there was always this risk, particularly for women who are healers, because if you were not successful, people were like, well, you're killing us, right, with your cures. But if you were too successful, people were like, how can she be so successful? Like, this is not natural. It must be magic, right? Only magic could possibly cure people with anise seed and brandy. And so Margaret Jones was accused of being a witch. And someone even testified, like, I was sick. And then she came to me and said, if I didn't take her medicine, I was going to get sicker. And then I didn't take her medicine and I got sicker. So therefore, I think she made me sick with her magic. So I would just buy her medicine. I was like, oh my God, like what? You got sick because you didn't take the medicine, right? But, and she was executed for that. Like, and of course, people added on other things like that. She had this familiar spirit, which looked like a small child. And when she was in jail, this demonic spirit appeared in her jail cell, and people in Charlestown said, oh, we had seen that spirit before running around Charlestown. But I think it was more like this healing part. And there was another healer in Lynn, Massachusetts, a woman named Anne Burt, around the same time, like 1650s, 1660s, who was, a successful healer. But again, she was, one of her clients was like, she is really forceful with her medicine. She really wants me to buy her medicine. And I didn't buy her medicine. I got sick. And she said, if I, didn't believe in her God also, if I didn't believe in her God, that I would get sicker. And so maybe Anne Brett was just really devout Christian, saying you have to believe in my God. But this person, like, who is her God, right? Is this the devil she's talking about here, right? And so she was also tried for witchcraft, but she was not executed. But in Anne Burt's case, there definitely was a male doctor, I think, who Anne Burt had been in conflict with, who, like, no, these are my patients. You are stealing my patients with your herbal magic, your herbal medicine. And so women healers were often in contact with male physicians. Male physicians had more power and more money, and often that kind of came into play, I think. There was even a man, that happened with a man named Roger Toothaker during the Salem witch trials. I think he lived in Billerica. And he positioned himself as a healer and, herbal medicines, but also he said he could heal people from witchcraft, right? And he came into conflict with a physician who said, no, you're full of crap, basically, and you're a witch. I don't need your competition for my business. I'm going to accuse you of being a witch. And Roger Toothaker was, I think he died in prison awaiting trial. So he was not executed, but did die in prison awaiting trial. So there's definitely something to what your caller mentioned there, that there was this issue with women working in the medical field. We're often like, ooh, we don't trust you too much, So
Right. And I know one guy who would have probably gotten tried for witchcraft because he's an amazing occultist. Our friend Ken Allen is out there, says, love the Bigfoot and the Bunny. Ken Allen, host of the Wizard's Table podcast, and he's been a guest in our show multiple times. We love Ken, and he's actually an occultist, so I would trust him. Herbal remedies.
And I just wanted to let you know, my daughter Elizabeth is listening to us.
Yes. It's a family affair, right?
Yes.
Hey, hi, Mom.
Yes. Elizabeth, I love you too, little fairy fae. That's what I call her. It's redundant.
That's good. It's interesting. There are, like, if you go to Salem today, which is a great place to visit, I always go there, and particularly around October, and like spend too much money on, I don't know, tarot cards and whatever I'm spending up there, herbs, whatever I buy. like Salem was the place where witches were executed. And even immediately after the trials ended in the like early 1700s, people were like, "Ooh, that was a big travesty. That was a tragedy." And Salem kind of had this cloud over it, right? And I think a lot of people in Salem wanted to forget that it had happened. Particularly, I think if you were descended from one of the judges or one of the accusers, like if you were a Putnam or a Corwin, it's like, can't we just sweep this under the rug? Like, let's forget that my grandfather hanged all these innocent people. And it's interesting now that Salem is the place where it is a center of occult activity and magical activity, right? And I think you can see like some of the magical activity that people do there. You can see the analogs from the past. Like they were fortune tellers in the past, right? People read tea leaves, people read palms, things like that. There was a guy named Samuel Wardwell who was executed as a witch in Salem, and he was a palm reader. And people said he was just super accurate. Like he could really get it down like this, like what you were doing. And that's why he was executed as a witch. But you can go to Salem now and there's still palm readers, right? It's still happening, a lot of them. Yeah. And so it's kind of interesting how it has continued. And I feel like, I know some people say, oh, it's like, there are some people I think who don't like that Salem celebrates kind of the occult and the witchy stuff the way it does, right? It has this kind of carnival atmosphere, particularly in October. Yes. They think, oh, it should be more somber, which I understand. But also I can see like perhaps it's penance for like these people were executed, these people were killed. So now it's no longer the town that executed witches, it's a town that celebrates witches in a different way. And I can see that there's some justice maybe in that, right? Some karmic payback a little bit. I
like that better, yeah.
Kind of like funerals now, they tend to call them celebrations of life. And
right.
Kind of put a positive spin on it. And there is such a great energy there, especially in October. There's so many people around and the streets are filled and it's just a great time. It's a lot of fun. And for our listeners that are outside of New England and haven't been to Salem, I highly recommend it. You know, give yourself some time for traffic and stuff to get in and out. And, you know, I think there's a train or something you can take as well. But
I agree. And I think when you go to Salem, what I'm struck by often is like there's so many women in Salem in October who are dressed as witches, right? Like buying the witch hats and whatever, like a huge variety of witch hats. And there's something nice about it, I think, right? It's like, it's kind of like an act of empowerment almost. Like these were the people who would have been most persecuted 300 years ago. And now you're free to like let your witchy aspect out if you want to do it in Salem. So it's kind of nice, I think, in that sense. And if you want to acknowledge like the historical stuff, you can go to the witch memorials or you can go to Gallows Hill. You can go to the more serious places, but then you can also kind of, I think, celebrate this witchy aspect that people have inside themselves also.
It is a lot of fun. And speaking of Warlock, it makes me think of seeing Christian Day there, you know, run some of the stores there, Hex and whatnot in Salem, riding around on a Segway. And Christian's awesome, who called out Charlie Sheen for calling himself a warlock back in the day. And that created a little hubbub in the news.
I remember that was a few years ago.
Yeah. And Lori Cabot, she's there and she's wonderful.
And she was the first like public witch in Salem. I think she opened the first magical shop in Salem. And so she, like, if you go to Salem today and see all these witch stores there, like Lori Cabot was the pioneer. She was the first person in the 70s, like, I'm opening a witch shop and we're just going to go for it. But it's interesting. There had been tourism, witch-related tourism in Salem starting probably, it was the 1850s. Nathaniel Hawthorne wrote The House of Seven Gables, which was a huge hit in America. People loved it. It was like the Stephen King / I don't know what, Danielle Steele combo book of the day, right? Because it got romance and horror. People ate it up. And it's set in Salem. And so people would come to Salem to see the places that Nathaniel Hawthorne described. And so even then, in the 1850s, people were like, maybe we can do some things to take advantage of these tourists. And so they start to sell souvenir spoons. They would sell hand creams like witch cream from Salem. And it really just expanded from the 1850s to the present. It picked up around probably like the 1940s, a woman named Marion Starkey wrote a really popular book about the Salem witch trials. With the name eludes me. I think A Delusion of Satan was her book. Really popular. It was like a psychoanalytic approach to the Salem witch trials, a big bestseller. And then Arthur Miller wrote The Crucible a few years later, which was a hugely popular play. And so tourism just picked up in Salem, and the town embraced it. Like the high school football team became the Witches. The police adopted that witch on the broomstick logo on their uniforms. The Chamber of Commerce adopted it. And so, it's been that way for a long time. It's not like tourism around witches started in the year 2010. Like, it's been going on since the 1850s. It's nothing really new there.
Sure. Especially when you go back to like Nathaniel Hawthorne and that and those people from then. I know he used to take some of the names he used in his books, like the Scarlet Letter and House of Seven Gables, from the headstones in a local cemetery.
From his own family almost. You know what I mean? He was it his great-grandfather? Great-grandfather or great-great-grandfather was one of the judges in the Salem trials. This man named John Hathorne. So his great-great-grandfather sent, multiple people to the gallows as a judge. And I think Nathaniel Hawthorne always felt some guilt about that his family had been responsible for the deaths of these people. And there's a lot of guilt in his books, right? His books are often about guilt, like family guilt. And people speculate that he added the W to his name. He changed his name from Hathorne to Hawthorne, maybe as a way to distance himself from his great-great-grandfather being this
I didn't know
judge.
that. That's very interesting.
Yeah.
Super interesting. And Gail Heisen from the Small, Medium, at Large podcast says, I've never been to Salem. After your last shows and this one, it's on my list. Can't wait to check it out. Yep.
She's gonna come stay with us. That's it.
Absolutely.
That's you gotta come stay with us.
We'd have a ball with Gail.
And just great things. House of Seven Gables is amazing to see, which is a real house. It was owned by Nathaniel Hawthorne's cousin, and he sort of adopted that house and built it into his story, And there is in the book, like evil Colonel Pynchon, who is like this wealthy Puritan, he accuses this poor man, Matthew Maul, I think his name is. He accuses this poor man of being a witch because he wants to steal Matthew Maul's land so he can build the House of Seven Gables. And Matthew Maul is like, if you steal my land, you're going to have blood to drink. And then Colonel Pynchon's like, blow it out your ear. I'm a rich old person. I don't care. So Matthew Maul is executed for being a witch. Colonel Pynchon steals his land and builds the House of Seven Gables. But on the day of the housewarming party, like everyone in Salem comes to see this massive, beautiful house. And of course, they go inside, and there is Colonel Pynchon dead with blood like bubbling out of his mouth, and he is dead. Which, of course, is based on an actual occurrence that happened in the Salem trials. And I'm going to get her name wrong, but I get all my Sarahs in the Salem witch trials. I believe it was Sarah Goode. A woman named Sarah Goode was accused of being a witch, and she was just full of vim and vinegar. And this man named Nicholas Noyes, who was a Reverend Nicholas Noyes, said, Sarah Goode, are you a witch? And she was like, I'm no more a witch than you are a wizard, things like that. She would throw it right back at them. But she was accused of being a witch. She was found guilty, and she was sentenced to hang. And she says, if you sentence me to hang, you will have blood to drink, which is actually a quote from the Bible about God giving, his enemies blood to drink. And she's using this language from the Bible. She's like, Reverend Noyes, you will have blood to drink if I'm executed. Well, she was executed. And then several years later, Reverend Noyes did die, and he had a brain hemorrhage, apparently, and blood came dripping out of his nose and mouth.
Oh my gosh.
And his family's like, boy, it was that witch's curse, right? But Nathaniel Hawthorne took that and incorporated it into his book. So it was based on an actual execution, an actual death. And
I had no idea. That is like
real events. Yeah.
Yeah. So it was probably just a coincidence, creepy, right? But it is creepy.
Well, you say probably. You have to wonder.
Yeah.
There's instances of witchcraft too. I think you talk in your book about, which I'm going to bring up on our screen here so people can see the cover. My software will work. Let's see.
Oh,
sorry.
Oh, wait, I have a copy. I'll hold it up.
There
we go. That's a little too shiny.
Much. The Witches and Warlocks of Massachusetts, which was just released, I believe this week, right? Or
September 1st. Yeah,
September 1st. And you have some accounts of more modern as well.
I do. I mean, I have one from 19. I don't want to open the book right now, but it's like 1926 or 1929, one of those dates. A man in Chelsea, Massachusetts he started to exhibit strange behavior. So again, it's like classic bewitchment behavior, like his body is contorted in strange positions. He's making weird noises. He feels like, pins and needles are being stuck in his body, whatever. And so his family in Chelsea bring in a physician. And the physician's like, oh, I don't know. I think it might be mental illness, or maybe he's having a nervous disorder or something like that. The family's like, we want a second opinion. We don't know if we believe you. And so they bring in what they call a witch doctor. And I just want to be clear here that they're using witch doctor here in like the pre-Hollywood sense of the word. Like, I think Hollywood's like a witch doctor is like somebody with like a big bubbling pot with shrunken heads and all this stuff, right? And that's kind of a weird racist stereotype from Hollywood movies from a certain era. But in this account from 1929, a witch doctor means basically a doctor who treats witches, right? Who treat witchcraft. Like if you have a problem with your ear, you go to the ear doctor. If you have a problem with your eye, you go to the eye doctor. If you have a problem with a witch, you go to the witch doctor. And so they bring in this witch doctor, and he's like, oh yeah, I can examine your son. He looks at this man. He's like, oh, clearly he's bewitched. I can cure him. I need to make a potion. And the potion had 9 ingredients. The only one that is written down was grass from a graveyard, which is interesting to me, right? Grass from a graveyard. And he made this potion. They give it to this man who's sick, and the man is no longer sick. So the bewitchment has ended and the witch doctor was successful. And so that's from like 1929. And that's recorded by a woman named Theda Kenyon. She wrote about it in a magazine article and later in a book at that time. So it was pretty contemporary. And so, unfortunately, she doesn't mention this in any names, which I would like to know the names of people and where they lived and things like that. Would have been helpful to know. But so that was from 1929, which is pretty contemporary, right?
20th century. And use of graveyard grass. Like
that's
graveyard dirt is more the common ingredient in so many things, right?
And it sounds sort of southern, right? Like when you're talking about hoodoo or things like that, often like graveyard dirt might be an ingredient. You wouldn't see graveyard grass from like Puritans. Like that was not an ingredient they would use. It was more like urine, nails, metal. They would use bay leaves, salt, things like that. They would not use grass from a graveyard. They were like, that sounds too spooky for us. We're not going down that road. So it's interesting. There was almost a witch trial in Salem in 1811 where a woman moved to Salem from Boston. Her name is recorded only as Miss Bancroft. So Miss Bancroft moves from Boston to Salem, and she lives in a neighborhood called Windmill Point in Salem, which is sort of north up near the train tracks now. And she starts to have the classic witch symptoms like contortions and pain and maybe speaking in tongues or whatever. And she says, I am being bewitched by an old woman who lives in Boston's North End. She is bewitching me. And these ministers come in to pray over her. And one of them even says he can see the spirit of this old woman from the North End hovering around her, causing the trouble in this young woman in 1811, right? So this is pretty late.
Yes.
People in town hear about this and they're very excited. Ooh, this is very exciting because they didn't have TV then or whatever. So like you get your entertainment elsewise. And so big crowds would gather outside of her house to hope to catch a glimpse of her. And I think she also started to give prophecies as well. So people were hoping to hear her prophecies from Miss Bancroft. And like the city leaders, like the mayor or the city councilor, whoever's like, we cannot have another witch trial in our town. Like we just, no. And so they kind of like this delegation marches to Miss Bancroft's house. And they say, Miss Bancroft, we're happy to have you stay with us in Salem. But if you stay in Salem, you have to go live in the poor farm, right? Which is only a step above prison, right? You have to go live in the poor farm.
Wow.
Or you can leave town forever. Those are her two options, like poor farm or get out of town. So she left, she moved to Maine, and that was the end of, like, you don't hear any more about her and her witchcraft, but it's interesting that the town leaders could see where things were going.
Yes.
We're like, we're going to put a stop to this. We do not want this to happen again. Like, it happened once and it was not good. Plus it was 1811, right? I mean, people were more knowledgeable at that point, I think.
Yeah, by that
Yes,
point.
by that point.
But really, in New England, I know a lot of the towns and the expansions that happen were over like little discrepancies over like, well, we don't really like the way you run the church over here, so we're going to build our church over here. We'll call it Rehoboth, for instance.
Right.
Right.
Before, right.
Right. And even like Salem, Massachusetts, now is a pretty discrete town, right? It's like a city by the ocean. It's not gigantic. But in the past, it was much, much bigger. So places like Danvers, Peabody, other places were all part of Salem. Salem was very, very big. And that's possibly one of the underlying causes of the Salem witch trials, is that Salem Village, which is now roughly contingent with Danvers, some people in Salem Village wanted to break away from Salem because it was too far away. Like, Salem town was 8 miles away. They're like, why are these people 8 miles away ruling over us? We want to be independent. Whereas other people in Salem Village were like, no, we want to stay part of Salem town because Salem town is wealthy. It's a port city. It's a fishing city. You know, it's a trade city. We want to be part of this wealthy town. We don't want to be a rural backwater. And so there was this conflict in Salem over whether it should break away or not. And there were other conflicts in town also, particularly over, like I mentioned, ministers. Not to get into too much weird historical detail for people, but like people in Salem fought with each other a lot over various things. And it was really hard to keep a minister. And, you know, every town in Massachusetts at the time needed a minister because it was a Puritan theocracy, basically. And so a minister was really important. But Salem just couldn't keep ministers because it was just, Salem Village could not keep ministers because people were argumentative and unfriendly, basically, and they wouldn't even often pay their ministers. So you see, like, as I mentioned, George Burroughs comes in to be a minister, and the Putnam family did not like him. The Putnams were sort of the wealthiest family, owned the most land. They did not like George Burroughs, so they convinced everybody else in town to not pay his salary. And so George Burroughs worked for 2 or 3 years as a minister without any salary. And in order to live, he then had to take out a loan. He had to borrow the money from the Putnams, who are the very family that had denied him his salary to begin with.
Oh.
And finally, he's like, I can't take this anymore. I'm leaving this nut house. And he goes to Maine. The Putnams, who are come across as very arrogant, then sue him for the money they loaned him because he couldn't repay it because they never paid him his salary. They take him to court. And he's like, I can only repay you the money that you loaned me if you pay me the 3 years salary that I was owed. And the judge is like, you have to pay him 3 years of salary. So
wow.
George Burroughs was paid his 3 years of salary, but then the Putnams accused him of witchcraft and he's executed. So like,
got him in the end.
They got him in the end, but like,
it's terrible.
But again, it is like this minister, you're fighting over the town, breaking away and paying the minister. It was a different world back then, I think.
It's funny you mentioned that people can be unfriendly in New England. Never.
Yeah.
Park our cars like everyone else.
I know, it's funny. There was some
a little upset here, I think, compared to other parts of the country. People they're more apt to flip you off if you drive past them or in a highway or whatever.
Yeah.
That's why they call us massholes,
Yeah, right.
Right. We have to embrace that term, like reclaim it. Like say, I am a masshole. You can own that term. Chris cannot, since you're in Rhode Island, right? So you can't say masshole.
Rhode Island's no better. I think they drive worse.
They drive worse.
Yeah.
They really do.
It's funny. There was a survey a while ago about, I think it was the least friendly states in the country. And Massachusetts and all the New England states were in the top of the survey. Like people said, these are the least friendly states in the country. And then there was a survey about like the smartest, most educated states in the country. And all the New England states were in the top there too. So there was like some, I don't know, are we unfriendly or are we just smarter than you and we know it? Like, I don't know what it is.
Arrogant, right?
I think we actually saw that.
Yeah,
a couple of months ago. We saw that. And I was like, wait, that's just something.
all this lore and this old history, how do you think that relates to like modern times and modern paranormal phenomena?
That's interesting. I feel like modern people in New England know that there are witch trials here, know their witches were executed here, right? That is well known. And that is built into the lore, I think, in a lot of places. Like so we're talking earlier about the Freetown State Forest. So the kids there are having the weird phenomenal, the weird activity, the weird experiences, and they say that it's a witch because you know that there were witches in Massachusetts, right, in the past. And so a lot of the modern stuff these days is about like ghostly witches or the witches of ghosts of the witch hunt victims or things like that. And whether the stories are true or not, the stories are out there. There's like a place in Andover, or North Andover, called Albino Road, which is an odd name for a road. It's just this dirt road in kind of a rural/suburban neighborhood. And it's got a big like bar across the road with a big "Do Not Enter" sign. And it's a place where like teenagers go at night to spook themselves because it's supposed to be haunted by the ghosts of these two teenage boys who were executed during the Puritan era because they had very pale skin, right? So they were albino, and the Puritans thought, oh, these people don't look like us, therefore they might be demons, and they were executed. And so supposedly these two ghosts now haunt that road. And so you don't want to go there at night because you'll encounter these vengeful ghosts. And
I don't blame them.
Right. Right. I would be angry too, right? I'd be very angry too. There's no record of any teenage boys being executed for being albino, right? So I don't think the story's necessarily true, but people go there and still have the experiences, and it's being interpreted through this lens of New England history and understanding that there are witch trials and Puritans here. So whether the story is true or not, this is how the story is interpreted, you know?
Sure. Now, with that being said, what do you think about that? Do you think about, is it psychosomatic? Do those teenagers or whatever, do they really manifest these two teenage boys?
That I don't, I guess my own beliefs about these things are kind of conditional. I say like I have conditional belief in these things. Like during the daytime when the sun is up and the lights are on, I'm like, oh, I don't believe in this, right? I am a skeptic. Mm-hmm. But then at nighttime, if I'm out in the woods or in a spooky cemetery, I'm like, ooh, like maybe I do believe in these things, right? when it's darker and a little scarier for me. So
sure, that's usually the thing, that's the dark and
greases the wheels.
Yeah.
I guess I just always come back to people experience strange things, and they have for as long as we have written records, right? Exactly. And now you might go out in the woods and you see like a large hairy monster. You're like, I saw Bigfoot in the Hockomock Swamp, right? I saw Bigfoot in the Hockomock Swamp. Hockomock Swamp. Yep. Maybe 100 years earlier, someone's like, I was out picking berries in the Hockomock Swamp and I saw a wild man, right? And he was like a hairy guy with a long beard, but I saw a wild man picking berries in the Hockomock Swamp. And maybe like 200 years earlier, somebody was like, I was picking berries in the swamp and I saw I think it was a demon. Like it was this hairy monster running through the woods. And I think I saw a demon in the Hockomock Swamp. And you could go back and back and back. Like the Middle Ages, they're like, oh, I saw a woodwose out in the woods while I was picking berries. Or the Greeks would be like, I saw a satyr. I saw a satyr in the woods. I was out picking figs and I saw a satyr. A goat man. It just goes on like endlessly. So I don't know what it is, but people keep experiencing the strange stuff,
I think you have some stories about goat men. And we talked to a while back, Becky Vickers,
yes, she
writes about Goatman's Bridge, which is
it's down south, right? Is that Virginia?
Yeah, she's so nice. She's so sweet.
Yeah, she's a really sweet person, and
she has this book, Secret of Goatman's Bridge. And
we'll have to buy it.
We have some goat man stories here in New England as well, right?
Yeah, I found three goat man stories. So it's not a ton of them. I wish there were more because I do like a goat man story. The best one I heard was from, I will get the name of the town wrong. Cherryfield, Maine, I think it's called. Cherryfield, Maine, a small town in Maine. And this gentleman is driving his truck through the woods in Cherryfield, Maine, sort of a rural area, driving his truck through the woods, listening to the radio. And he's driving, and suddenly the truck stops and the radio dies. He's like, oh, this is weird. I'm out in the middle of the woods. I wonder what happened. He gets out of his truck, pops open the hood to look at the engine, and as he does that, he sees this man emerge from the woods, step out into the road. And it looks like he's got a beard. He's wearing a red plaid shirt. But then from the waist down, he's naked, and he has goat legs, and he has horns.
Good Lord.
And he walks across the road and just kind of looks at the guy with the truck and smiles like, gives a smile and goes back into the woods. And the guy's like, holy crap. Like, what was that? And then the radio comes back on and the truck starts up again.
Wow.
And the guy's like, I'm getting in that truck and getting out of these woods as fast as I can.
Yeah.
I love that. The goat man's kind of a hick.
Yeah, he is like the red flannel shirt is a thing, right? He's not going to be like, it's Maine. It's cold. He's not going to be naked. Yeah. He's wearing a red flannel shirt.
You can't have the goat man.
But that's the first that I know of encounter that I've heard that it actually, say like EMP or something like that a spirit shut off, or an entity shut off your car. That's more like an UFO.
Paranormal.
Yeah.
Type experience.
That's a really great story. Well, creepy, but
flannel shirt.
I feel like there's there's this phenomenon, and then you assign it to different entities, right? And it overlaps. Like some of these stories we're talking about with the witches, it sounds like a poltergeist, but in some other place, maybe that's an elf or a fairy causing that in your house, right, or something. So in this case, it was a goat man, an elemental buried in your basement somehow by mistake. The other goat man story that I really like is from Cape Cod. I think it's from like the late 70s or early 80s, where a kid is home alone on like Saturday afternoon. His parents are out doing errands. So he's home alone. He's watching TV. So like the TV is like on the opposite wall from him. And above the TV is a window looking out to the backyard. And it's like a snowy December day. The snow has fallen. It's December. So he's sitting there watching TV, whatever he's watching, Creature Double Feature or something, right? It's the 70s or 80s. Mm-hmm. And he's looking at the TV, and then he looks up at the window, and there is a hairy face looking in the window, like a man or a humanish face covered in dark hair. And the kid screams, and whatever's looking in the window screams and runs off. And the kid's like, holy cow. And he calls his friends, like, are you pranking me? And they're like, no, like, we're all at home. We're not anywhere near your house. And so he sits in his house till his friends come over. And then they go outside in the backyard to look for footprints. But the footprints they see are cloven hooves. Instead of a Bigfoot footprint, they're cloven hooves. I'm like, oh, that is a creepy twist ending to that story. Wow. Like, I did not see that coming.
No.
Right. And you mentioned the window. And earlier you mentioned one of my favorite scenes in any kind of horror movie.
Oh, yes.
Was Salem's Lot, where his friend, the child has his school friend is at the window and they're scratching at the window to come in,
Yeah.
And a floating kid. It was done with like cheesy effects, but we're going back to the 80s there with the TV special Salem's Lot. And you mentioned Creature Double Feature. So for those of you who don't know, if you grew up in the New England area, you may be familiar with a show that was on Saturday afternoons.
Channel 56.
Channel 56 on UHF.
That's when we had like 4 channels.
That's right. And you had minimal channels. I tuned in that bad boy every week.
Thank God. Stop seeing our age. All right.
I know, right? But,
it's, with age comes wisdom, right?
That's right.
Yeah, I like that. Yes. Thank you.
A lot of good memories of Creature Double Feature.
When I was a kid, like I grew up in the 70s, and there was a lot of paranormal stuff in the culture at that time. So like Bigfoot, UFOs, the Bermuda Triangle, which is less popular now than it used to be. That you still hear about it every now and then. Mm-hmm. Things like In Search of Noah's Ark, like crystal skulls, ancient astronauts, all this stuff kind of was bubbling up in the early 70s. And my older brother, he's my only brother, but he's older than me, was really into like a lot of that stuff. He had like these books by Arthur C. Clarke about like Arthur C. Clarke's Unexplained Mysteries. I can't remember what they were called, but all these books and books about Bigfoot. And he had this fear, and I inherited that fear. I think that Bigfoot would look in our window while we were asleep. right? That was a fear. And we lived on the second story of a house in an urban neighborhood. Like our backyard was like, 50 feet by 50 feet. Like, the houses were 10 feet apart. Like, it was a dense neighborhood. We were not out in the country. But there was this fear that Bigfoot would look in the window. And it is interesting. You read a lot of you read some Bigfoot stories where Bigfoot does look in the window, right? That's what Bigfoot does.
Yes.
Like, he comes to your house and he looks in the window. Like, and other creatures, that's like a common, I think, paranormal thing. Like, there's something outside your house and it looks in the window. And what is it? Like, I don't know, but it's like this, like, if you look at like symbolically, it's like the things you don't want to think about, like the other world is like just gently saying, hey, I'm out here. Don't forget me. Like, I'm looking in your window.
Yeah.
And you're like, I don't want.
Like the
Right.
chimney you mentioned, in the earlier times, the chimney was the only open way in, right? They come into the chimney. But in more modern times, that glass, that glass is easier to get through than the wall next to it, right? That's framing it.
Yeah.
So there's a little bit of a vulnerability there. Don't look in my window. And
Oh, yeah.
keeping Bigfoot.
Even as a kid, I watched some movie about dinosaurs. I remember the name was called Dinosaurus, which I don't remember what year it's from, but it's about like some construction project that wakens up some dinosaurs, but also a caveman somehow is awoken, which doesn't quite make sense, but this caveman is awoken. And he does look in a window during the movie and scares somebody. And I had like a nightmare after that of like the caveman looking in our window of my house. And it's that same like hairy, primitive creature looking in your window like, which is terrifying. People just want to keep these things out, like, whether it's a witch or whatever, keep it out of your house.
To grow up, because we did have things like In Search Of, and I know quicksand I thought was going to absolutely kill us before we reached adulthood.
I was very concerned about quicksand. Giant spider webs. I thought I would somehow get stuck in a giant spider's web, which has not happened.
Right there with you with that one.
Still there.
I'm still there.
Has not happened yet. I mean, now we're more concerned. I'm more concerned about Lyme disease. Like when I go out to like look at paranormal places, I'm like, put on the bug spray.
Oh yes, definitely have to do that.
Certainly more of a threat than quicksand at this point.
It is.
Yeah.
So interesting. But I loved In Search Of with Leonard Nimoy, and all those things, and Bigfoot. Definitely, we had the original pictures of Bigfoot.
That was in 1979. That was the oh goodness,
Patterson film.
Video.
Yeah, it was an interesting time to grow up. I remember the movie In Search of Bigfoot came out, and my family didn't see it, maybe because my parents knew that it would be too terrifying for me, because I was like, 5 or something, or 7. I don't know, I was young. But we did go see In Search of Noah's Ark, which came out like the next year or whatever, which I will say was a terrible movie. Like, it was just a terrible movie. Even as like an 8-year-old, I'm like, this movie is terrible. It was just like clips from old Bible movies. It was like models of Noah's Ark in somebody's bathtub. I was like, I am not convinced by this movie. And I'm like 8 years old in 1975 or whatever.
A little bit fake there. Yeah, our special effects weren't that great. I kind of remember, I think it was a That's Incredible show. And they had like a haunted Toys R Us or something like that. And, a little baby carriage would roll down the aisle, on Halloween on a certain day. There's a lot of lore about that, certain days.
Certain days.
Times always come up, right, at midnight or
the witching hour.
The witching hour is not midnight, people.
It's 3 a.m. 3 a.m.
Right?
When I was a kid, again, growing up in Haverhill, there's a rural area in Haverhill called Rocks Village, kind of down on the Merrimack River, away from the main part of the city. And the kids in that neighborhood, in that area, said that on Halloween night, a woman named the Countess would rise from her grave and kind of walk down the road. And they said that, people would stay up to try to see if they would see the Countess. And that was kind of a local legend in Haverhill, the Countess's grave. And it was she was an actual countess. She was born in the U.S., but she married a French count during like the Revolutionary War. Like, he had come over, during the war, and they got married. And then she died at a very young age. And so her grave in the Rocks Village Cemetery was surrounded by an iron cage.
Yes.
And people assumed that the iron cage was there to keep her in, right? One, she was a countess. And at the time, anybody who was a count or a countess, you would assume was a vampire, right? From Count Dracula.
Right.
And the iron cage is like, oh, this clearly is meant to keep her from coming out of her grave to attack people.
Yeah.
And so kids in that area was like, oh, yeah, she will come out of her grave on Halloween night. And I remember I think I was a junior in high school. And I went with a friend of mine, Christine, and this guy, Cesar, to see A Nightmare on Elm Street. It had just come out in the theater. We were like terrified because we were the perfect age for that movie, right? Just watching teenagers be slaughtered. We're like, ah.
Yeah, great.
Oh, yeah.
We were terrified. And then Christine's like, oh, we should go to the Countess's grave. Let's go to the Countess's grave. And so it was late at night. We drove to the cemetery and we drive in her car to this Countess's grave. And there it is with this big iron cage and she's shining in her headlights. And we hear this noise, like this scratching noise on the car. And I was like, what is that scratching noise? And then I hear it again, even louder. I'm like, okay, this is getting spooky. Then a third time, even louder. And then I hear Cesar start to laugh, and he's in the back seat, and he had stuck his hand out the window, and he was like scratching the roof of the car with his hands. I was like, But it is this kind of like, you go to these places, these legend trips to see the spooky thing, right? Which is interesting. It's kind of a fun activity. And it turns out the cage was around the Countess's grave, not because she was a vampire and was going to come out and kill children on Halloween night, but because it had been a very popular tourist attraction in the 19th century. She'd been memorialized in a poem by John Greenleaf Whittier. It was very popular at the time. So tourists were coming and chipping parts of her grave off to bring home as a souvenir. And so they put the cage up to keep tourists from actually damaging her grave. But we had forgotten that by the 80s, right? We just thought, oh, cage, grave, spooky, Countess.
Keep her in there.
Yeah.
Dracula,
you know.
Right.
Yeah.
You
know.
So interesting.
A lot of places here, but also in England, have a lot of places where they graves where they have the cages, and
Right.
a lot of people think that it's vampires or whatever. And
Sure.
actually, they did that because there was, at that time back in the 1800s, there was grave robbing for, believe it or not, cadavers.
Yeah, medical school, like medical
Medical
students.
school.
Take the
Yeah.
cadaver. I think
Yeah.
we even had a comment there. Well, back then, Joshua says grave robbers were a problem.
Exactly.
Yeah,
Yes,
it was
thank
grave
you, Joshua.
robbers, and they
I was-
actually take the bodies, sell the cadaver.
And they paid big money for them.
Yeah.
Seemed like it. It's
You know,
probably just a
that
few
people-
pence, but
There's a story about a guy in Malden named Ephraim. I would say Ephraim Gray. I'm forgetting all the things about. Hold on, I'm going to open this one up just so I can remember his last name. I don't want to forget his name. Yeah, Ephraim Gray, right? And this is a legend from Malden, Massachusetts, just north of Boston. And so Ephraim Gray lived in a big house in Malden, just himself and a manservant. And the neighbors were always suspicious because they would almost never see Ephraim Gray, and they would see like strange flashing lights from the house and like strange smells emitting. And like, the manservant would go out and buy food and bring it back home, or sometimes he would go out and buy like strange chemical supplies and bring them home. But people almost never saw Ephraim Gray. And so they're very suspicious, like, what's going on in this house? Is it some sort of occult activity? And finally, one day, the manservant emerges from the house and says, neighbors, I have to tell you something. Ephraim Gray is dead. But he had been working all his life to perfect a formula for immortality. He wanted to become immortal. And so he created a version of that potion, and he took it. It didn't keep him alive forever, but it has prevented his body from ever decaying. So Ephraim Gray's body will never, ever decay. And people are like, oh, wow. So I guess he was like a crazy alchemist or something like that. So Ephraim Gray is buried in a cemetery in Malden. And supposedly his body, right, would never decay. And the manservant inherited everything and left town. So several years later, some medical students, supposedly from Harvard, are looking for bodies to, steal. And they dig up Ephraim Gray's body. And they are freaked out to discover that he has indeed not aged at all, that he is in perfect condition. This is like 50 years later. And the medical students like, oh, crud. Like they slam the coffin shut and run away. Like, oh my God, he's actually still alive or whatever. He is not decayed at all. So they run away. And then like another 50 years later, a road is being put through the cemetery. And so these workers come to, they have to move Ephraim Gray's body to another part of the cemetery. And as they do it, they open the coffin. But they find that Ephraim Gray's body is indeed in perfect condition, but that his head is missing and that someone has stolen his head.
Oh my God.
Although his body has not decayed at all. And people said, oh, I bet those Harvard students came back and stole his head, right? Those Harvard students probably stole his head.
Absolutely.
They want to study it. And so the workers go to get their supervisor and like to bring him back to say, we found this headless body. What do we do? The supervisor comes back with the workers and they look in the coffin and it's empty.
Come on.
And they say that Ephraim Gray has left his grave and is now kind of wandering around Malden looking for his head.
Oh, wow. Oh, that's a great story.
That's an awesome story.
It's a good story. Is it true? I don't know, but it's a good story. And it involves grave robbers, right? So it's
yeah. But that's a wonderful thing about folklore. You don't necessarily have to prove it out. I mean, it exists because people talk about it, because those stories exist over the generations and they get retold and it takes on a life of its own.
Right.
Most of them, there's a truth behind them. I swear.
Usually some
most of those
truth, something happened. And
there may have been like an actual Ephraim Gray, right? And maybe his head was missing for some reason, or who knows, right? It's one sad thing about grave robbers I read, not to bring things down, but I just had read that medical students were more likely to rob cemeteries of Black people because they were like less well protected. Like wealthy cemeteries had big fences and big gates around them, but cemeteries for poor people often didn't have fences. They couldn't hire guards, right? So if you were poor, if you were Black, you were much more likely to have your family member's corpse stolen and used for medical experiments.
That cemetery itself, it might have been like over on the side of town kind of thing, rather than in the town center,
right?
The church.
It's awful.
Yeah.
Yeah, it is strange. I think you also mentioned sea serpents, which I have not seen a sea serpent myself. I don't think ever, but sea serpents are just so cool and fascinating.
I have never seen a sea serpent myself. I've seen we go to Truro on the Cape a lot in the summer.
Beautiful.
And we used to go to Truro. We've been going there for years and years. And in recent years, we've seen a lot of seals show up in Truro. And then now there are sharks in Truro. So it's just a matter of time, I think, before the sea serpents show up as well. And we're just like, we're not going in the water ever again, but we still will just go to the beach and sit on the sand.
You say that. I remember taking my kids there before the sharks kind of blew up, maybe about 10 years ago. And they were starting to come in bigger numbers, and like the next day in the local newspaper, there had been like walrus or seal carcasses, on the beach where, wow, we were just here.
Yeah.
It was Truro that we had spent the day at, but gorgeous beach.
Yeah, we were at the beach one day and we actually were sitting on the beach thinking, maybe we should go swim in the water. We saw a seal swimming by us and it was very close to shore, like 6 feet off, and had a big bloody chunk taken out of its back. I'm like, we're not going in the water.
Now, people don't understand, these seals are not like the little fur seals that they used to club
or the sea lions or anything like that.
They're huge.
They're huge. They're beasts. They look like sea beasts.
Last month it's funny that you had said that. We just saw that. Chris is like, do you see the seal? I'm like, that's not a seal, that's a guy's head, he's swimming. No, that's a seal. I'm like, oh my God, it is.
The head is the size of your own head.
They're huge. It's
water. I think it was Head of the Meadow Beach, actually.
Okay, which is beautiful.
Yeah, absolutely gorgeous. And
so you mentioned like a sea serpents, right? I think the earliest sea serpent account comes from this English writer named John Jocelyn. He visited New England, and what's his book called? Like Narratives of a Journey to New England, I think is one of his books from like 1660 or something like that. And his books are very entertaining. They're not, I don't know, like he doesn't sound like he's describing entirely the real world to me. Like he's saying when he sailed over from England, the sailors on the ship needed to get food, so they captured these sea turtles and brought the sea turtles up on the deck to eat them. And then the sea turtles cried, they wept because they knew they were going to be eaten, right? So he tells some stories like, oh, that doesn't quite sound like the modern world to me. But he went to Maine, like probably York or up in that area. And he talked to some of the early settlers there who told him some really interesting stories. And one of those stories was that this English settler, was in a canoe with some Native Americans canoeing across a bay. And as they're canoeing across this bay, like I think it was Penobscot Bay or something, they see this sea serpent coiled up on a rock. And the settlers says, it's like thick, like it's a cable, but it's thick like this, like 6 or 8 inches around, like a big giant snake. And the settler's like, ooh, I want to shoot it. I'm going to shoot it. The Native American's like, do not shoot that. You're not going to hurt it. You're just going to piss it off. Just leave it alone. So they just keep going past this gigantic sea serpent. That's from like 1660 or something like that.
Wow.
He also tells an interesting story from the same area where, and I remember the name of the settler involved, a guy named Mr. Mitten, Mittin. Mr. Mitten is again out canoeing in Penobscot Bay when a hand comes out of the water and puts itself over the edge of his canoe. And then another hand comes over there, and this merman, like he calls it a triton, this triton comes up out of the water like, ah, and is kind of trying to get into his canoe. And Mr. Mitten has an axe, and he chops off one of the triton's hands. The triton's like, ah, and sinks back into the water, and the water is stained purple with this triton's blood.
Oh, wow.
Which that's also from Maine, which is kind of crazy, right? I think.
Yeah,
you don't see that happen these days too often.
No.
No, you don't. But sea serpents were definitely a thing.
Yeah.
The ships and stuff, they seem to
Gloucester,
sea monsters.
Yes, Gloucester,
famous sea monster in the 1800s, where dozens and dozens of people saw this sea monster repeatedly in Gloucester Harbor. And what was it like? There's lots of speculation. Oh, it was this type of fish, or maybe it was a fish caught in some sort of trap or net, so it looked bigger than it was. And I'm always just a little skeptical of those explanations, because I feel like the people back then knew fish, right? They had been living there for hundreds of years. The people in Gloucester, they were fishermen. They knew the water. They knew what was in the water. So for them to see something that was unusual, it probably was something unusual. I don't know what it was, but lots of like dozens and dozens of people, like from sailors to like wealthy women in town, like looking through telescopes, like people saw this sea monster swimming around in Gloucester. And it became a little embarrassing, though, for like these scientists from Harvard, because they wanted to capture and study the sea serpent. Like, we want to capture and study the sea serpent. And someone walking along the shore in Gloucester found this, what they assumed was a baby sea serpent. It was like a snake, maybe like 2 or 3 feet long, and had big humps on it, like supposedly the giant sea serpent. The giant sea serpent was like 30 or 40 feet long. This little snake was like maybe 3 feet long. And so these naturalists, these scientists at Harvard said, we'll buy that from you. This is clearly the baby sea serpent. And so they bought it and they brought it back to Harvard and they studied it. Like, oh, this is a totally different species. This is a baby sea serpent, and it grows to be 30 or 40 feet long. And then someone who was an expert in snakes came in and said, no, this is not a sea serpent. This is just a black snake. This is a common snake that's found in New England, and it has an infection, and that's why it has these big humps on its back. This is not a sea serpent at all. The scientists are like, oh, we're so embarrassed. Like, we can't believe we misinterpreted a snake. But people saw the sea serpent for years and years and years up and down the coast. And there's a book about it. Is it just called like The Great New England Sea Serpent, I think, or something like that, about all the sightings. I mean, it was seen in Boston Harbor, it was seen off Castle Island and places like that. So
wow.
That's so interesting. I imagine a whole town watching it. Like, it must have been out there for some time, and this really had to be talk of the town.
Yeah.
Absolutely. They would know the fish. They would know what's in the water.
I believe that too. Yeah.
The fishing industry.
It's like a trade route. I mean, that's what they did they still do, with their lives.
Yeah.
So.
Right. I mean, plenty of fishermen still in Gloucester, right? So that's my assumption. They would know what things were. It's and there have been a few mermaid sightings. Like, there was the Triton that Mr. Mitten killed up there. There was also one supposedly seen around Nantucket. This is from a book by Edward Rowe Snow. I don't know if you know Edward Rowe Snow, but he was like a colorful character in Boston, and he wrote a lot of books about nautical folklore. And he said that there was mermaid was seen, kind of off Nantucket near these woods, near this lighthouse, seen in the water. And then people saw this trail, basically like something had crawled out of the water through the grass and bushes into the woods. And people followed that trail from the shore up into the grass and bushes into the woods. And they found it looked like a nest, like something had come out of the water and made this giant nest. And I didn't know that mer people made nests on the land, but Edward Rowe Snow said perhaps they did. So this was Nantucket. I don't remember the name of the lighthouse it was near, but
wow.
That's I think that's late 19th century, early 20th century, that story.
And maybe like the turtles, they breed in the same.
Right. It could just be a turtle or a merman or a mermaid. Who knows? So who knows what lurks in that water,
It's very true.
I'm going to give you the reverse interview question. How did you get started with all this stuff? Like what got you going, your interest in folklore and these oddities? What first got you?
Yeah.
Was it a feature, double feature? Was it
it was kind of a bunch of things. Like I was always that kid who liked folklore or mythology or things like that, right? So I had my parents got me books on Greek mythology, Norse mythology, and they had some even old ones like Edith Hamilton's book on mythology around the house. So I was always very much into those things. And I was a kid who liked Dungeons and Dragons, and there was a lot of actually folklore in Dungeons and Dragons, right? A lot of the monsters are from folklore of different cultures and things like that. Mythology, right? It's all incorporated in there. So I always appreciated those sorts of things. Plus, growing up in the 70s, there was all this sort of paranormal stuff in the culture. It was just bubbling up. I went to college. I got a couple degrees in anthropology, which I was also interested in, like mythology and folklore then, but maybe from a more academic sense. But still, the interest continued. And it was only when I was like probably in my late 20s, I realized I didn't know a ton of information about the folklore of this area. Like I had lived in New England my whole life. I went to college in Maine, but I didn't know very much about the folklore of New England. So I started to just read, and there was not a lot on the internet then. I remember actually like having to go to a rare bookseller to buy a certain book from the 1800s and things like that. And I just started to read, and the more I read, the more I found. Like I always like to look at the footnotes. Like when I'm reading a book and I find it interesting, a story, I'll see if there's a footnote. If you can go to the footnote, you can go to the original source. And sometimes the original source has more stories, and just like this endless spreading web of like weird stories in New England. That's sort of how I got interested in it. And my brain and my bookshelves were just filling up with this information. So I wanted to do something with it. So in 2008, I started my blog, which is just called New England Folklore, newenglandfolklore.blogspot.com. It's right there at the bottom of the screen. And so I've been updating that for 13 years, which is like, in horror movies where someone has that old dusty book covered in cobwebs that they open up. That's how I feel about my blog. It's 13 years old, which is really old for a blog, right? It's like it should be bound in human skin. It's so old.
Oh my God.
Necromicon.
Yeah, exactly. And then, I wrote Legends and Lore of the North Shore, and then this current book also. And the current book, Witches and Warlocks in Massachusetts, one of the reasons I wrote that is because I always wanted a book that had all the witch stories from New England in one place. And it's really hard to find. Like there are a lot of books about the Salem witch trials that have all the information there, but often those are more academic, right? Like historians are approaching it to try to prove or disprove certain theories about why the witch trials happened, which are good, right? They have really interesting information, but I just wanted something that had like the straightforward story of that, along with like all the other stories, which I knew were out there, even the modern ones like the Ghostly Twins of Albino Road or the Freetown State Forest Witch or those things. And so I finally said, okay, I'm just going to put all these stories that I have in one place. And so I kind of compiled them and put them in one place. And one thing I always do is I do list my sources. Like that, for me, that's really important to list sources because for myself, I like to look at the source. Like I want to go back to the original story. And also I want to give credit to people who collected these, like Christopher Balzano collected that Freetown State Forest witch story. So he needs to get credit. Like that's not my story. Like that is a story he found. Or like stories from the Wampanoag on Cape Cod. I have some Wampanoag witchcraft stories. Like I note where those came from. Like I am not a Wampanoag person. Those are not my stories. And I want to give credit for the people whose stories those are. So I always make sure I list the credits. And some of the credits go back to
really
like...
great of you to do.
Oh, that's wonderful.
Yes.
It should be like that.
So I have like seriously 10 pages of sources, which some people, you don't have to read the sources if you don't want, but if you want the sources, I have like 10 pages of sources at the end of the book, you know, for the
That's
people
wonderful.
who are curious about that sort of stuff.
That's really interesting. And what, besides Freetown State Forest, what are some of the other maybe scarier places you've been in New England?
Freetown State Forest was spooky. I will say, if you've ever been to Dungeon Rock in Lynn, is a really odd place to go. It's worth visiting. It's in a park in Lynn, so it's a big kind of nature reserve with like lots of hills and trees and things like that. And there was a legend in Lynn, an old legend, that a pirate named Thomas Veal, Veal, had taken his treasure into this forest, and he was buried alive with his treasure during an earthquake. And this is an old legend. It goes back pretty far. So in the 19th century, like the mid 1800s or so, when spiritualism was a popular thing, this man named Hiram Marble consulted a spiritualist medium. The spiritualist medium got in touch with the ghost of Thomas Veal. And the medium was like, Thomas Veal says you should start digging for this treasure. Like, he will guide you through me to this treasure. And the treasure's buried under this gigantic rock, Dungeon Rock, which is this massive, it's like a hill. It's not a rock, it's a hill. It's like 50 feet high or whatever. At least it's a giant hill. And so Hiram Marble started to dig into solid rock to find the treasure. And he dug and dug and dug for like 15 years or so. And the ghost of Thomas Veal was always encouraging him through this spiritualist medium, like, oh, dig a little more to the left. You're getting close. Keep on going. Keep on going. And like other spiritualists would give Hiram Marble money to encourage him to keep it up. Like, this is a testament to spiritualism. And finally, like, Hiram Marble died. And he had tunneled down. It's like, you know, he tunneled like, let's say 150 feet down into the earth.
Wow.
Oh, wow.
Through stone. He died. Then his son continued to dig for like another 5 or 6 years until he died too, or gave up. And so you can go to Dungeon Rock in Lynn and go down into the tunnel that Hiram Marble and his son dug that goes down into solid rock into the earth. And it's like 150 or 200 feet deep. And there are stairs at different points, but it's just like a corkscrew going down, 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 down through solid rock.
I never knew that.
So you hit the bottom, and then that's the end. And we went on a hot August day. It was like 95 degrees and humid. By the time I was at the bottom, it was so cold I could see my breath.
Oh,
like, amazing. Amazing. And I would just say, like, I don't know if it really was the ghost of Thomas Veal, but why are you listening to the ghost of a pirate? Right? He murdered people. He killed people. He stole their money. Don't listen to him. Like, just don't listen to him. I would say,
right.
No, not the best person to trust, I would say. The other interesting place I've been or spooky. I've been to a bunch of spooky places, but I would say the Ramtail Mill area in Foster, Rhode Island, which some people may be familiar with it, but it was like a successful mill area in like the late colonial era, by a stream which powered the mill. And according to the legend, the manager of the mill, he wasn't the owner, it was owned by this wealthy family, but was the manager of the mill, killed himself. Like, he hanged himself on the bell that would be used to summon people to work in the mill. And I think he maybe hanged himself because he was like in love with the owner's daughter. Like, there are different explanations of how he hanged himself, right? Or he didn't get promotion. And so he hanged himself on this rope. And so when it's morning time, like, the workers hear the bell ring, like, oh, it's time to go to work. Let's go to the mill. They go into the mill, and there they find the manager hanged by the rope. Like, this is terrible, right? This is not good. The owners like cut him down, like, everybody get back to work. There's nothing to see here. Just get back to work. And so people get back to work, but they start to notice strange things happening. And at night, they will see a light in the mill when there's nobody in the mill. or they'll hear the bell ringing late at night, and they go into the mill, and the bell's ringing, and the rope's moving, but there's nobody there to move the rope. And the manager's like, "Oh, you're just all superstitious," but they cut the rope off. They're like, "Just in case, we're cutting the rope off."
Yeah.
But then the bell still continues to ring, even though there's no rope, right? The bell just keeps ringing, and it's this dead manager haunting the place. And so it's cursed. Like, the mill is cursed, and the workers won't work there anymore, and they move away, and eventually it's abandoned and falls into ruin. And that's the legend. I don't know if there's a different story, but so you can go into Foster, Rhode Island and find these ruins in the woods, and it's a decent sized area. It's like the part we were at was almost like a small village, and I think there are different parts of it. But it's quite spooky. Like, we were there alone, and it was just spooky. And I tried to take photos with my iPhone, and they did not come out. They came out just pure white. I was like, that is spooky.
Is that right? That's very interesting.
Really insane when you think about that.
We like Ramsdale Mill, and
yeah,
talking before the show, we actually went there recently for the first time, which is surprising. And like you mentioned, sometimes you don't know your own folklore, or you hear it, you take it for granted in a way. If you grew up in an area, like, I've heard that story, you don't think too much about it, but then you go actually explore these things, and there's a reason why people talk about them.
Right.
And yeah, you can see where the wheel was from the mill, and there's actually a location nearby where there's a better or more pronounced foundation than what you see at the actual mill. And a lot of people report that being haunted by,
or they see the light.
Peleg, I think his name
Peleg.
Yeah.
See the
like
ghostly
Peleg Walker, I think his name is.
Yeah, Walker, yes.
Yeah.
And they see the ghostly lights and him walking around there where there were floors once built in this foundation. But it's not actually the factory, But we did get an EVP from the factory, which is cool.
Yeah.
It said, "Help me," which is so common, and I don't know why this is. And anybody out there, help me and get out. I like the most common thing that
we get.
Discarnate spirits.
You're giving me mixed messages. You want the help, or do you want me to get out? Like, which is it?
What? Yeah.
Help me and then get out, right?
Yeah, exactly.
But I still can't believe you took pictures there, and they came out white.
On a phone, on an iPhone, which
that's
see. It's a good.
I was creeped out. I was definitely creeped out by that, because it was I'd never seen that happen before. And the only other place that I saw that happen, but not to the same extent, was at the Spider Gate Cemetery right outside Worcester.
For the love of Ostara, I do not. I can't.
Yeah, our listeners know we're all about Spider Gates, and you're not really supposed to investigate it, so we hate to send people there. But I gotta tell you,
it's
something going on. It's not really a cemetery. I think
it's the woods around it. Surround the cemetery. It's ridiculously haunted. Itself, just sinister.
I found the Ramtail Mill to me spookier than Spider Gates.
Interesting.
But I think it's just a matter of, I don't know. Like, I love a good cemetery. I go walk in cemeteries all the time just to relax. Like, I'm a cemetery person. Although
go to Spider Gates and they're like, oh, we never get anything there or see anything paranormal. But when Kristen and I go, it just, I don't know, something about it. I can't really put my finger on it. I don't know why these things happen, but I would consider them.
I don't like it.
We went to
I feel I go there with an arsenal now. I'm like all hooked up with all kinds of stuff, from holy water. I'm eclectic. I'm not kidding. It's an arsenal, I swear. Holy water to the hoodoo things, and
do you have like a string of garlic bulbs around your neck?
Yes.
The super soaker full of holy water, just in case, like a horror movie, like Lost Boys or something.
Right.
That is awesome. The book is called Witches and Warlocks of Massachusetts, and if I'm not mistaken, you can get this book pretty much anywhere. If people just Google it, I wanted to put a link to it. Do you have a preferred place that they go?
No, it's Amazon, Bookshop, Books A Million, Barnes and Noble. It's on all those places. Wherever you buy books, you can pick it up. And I'm excited. So I want to put all the witch stories in one place. It's not all the witch stories because I ran out of space, but it's a lot of witch stories. And I think I also want to just capture, preserve these stories, because some of them are a little more obscure from books that are no longer in print and things like that. And I just want to make sure that those stories were in one place for people who are interested in these things to have in one easy reference,
wonderful.
I guess.
It's wonderful. It looks like a great book, and we're going to add that to the shelf behind us.
Yes, we are.
For sure.
Thank you.
No, you've got some
You're
other
welcome.
books out there. Just tell people real quick. Legends and Lore of the North Shore. I don't think I started that poem thing, right? And Magical Hope, British and Irish Fairies, contributed a chapter there from Puritans to Pukwudgies for people who want to know more about Pukwudgies. They can find that there. And I also see you contributed a chapter to Real Witches of New England. So fantastic.
Yes.
It's really good stuff. And I've loved these stories. Thank you for taking the time to talk with us.
My pleasure. This was a lot of fun. It's a good way to spend an afternoon, right? It was a lot of fun. You guys are great hosts.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. We'll be right with you. I'm just going to wrap this up. Say bye. Thank you so much. That's all the time we've got for this week. And next week, we're actually going to do a little bit more talking about the Ramtail Mill and some other haunted locations. We have Tom D'Agostino joining us. I wrote a book on that legend about.
He did.
We're going to get into some of that stuff and maybe dig a little deeper. So stick around for that. We'll see you next week. Have a great week, guys.
Bye.
Thank you.